Hello, everybody. You're very welcome. My name is Roseanne Kenny, and I'm the director of Mercer's Institute for Successful Ageing in St. James's Hospital in Dublin and the chair of medical gerontology at Trinity College, Dublin. I'd like to welcome you all to this MISA 2020 annual public lecture and the first e-lecture, which is joined today by over 1,000 attendees. So very welcome all. From Ireland, from the UK, from Canada, of course, which is where our guest speaker will be joining us from the US, many European countries, and also Asian countries. You are all very welcome. MISA, just to tell you a little bit about MISA, which is Mercer's Institute for Successful Ageing, it was enabled by a philanthropic gift. The support of Mr. Chuck Feeney, and hello Chuck if you're listening in San Francisco, and Atlantic Philanthropies and the Irish Department of Health. It's a very unique clinical research building representing the culmination of 30 years of planning by my predecessors, Professors Coakley, Walsh, and Lawler. Our mission is to advance the conditions for successful aging. Never more pertinent than at this particular time of the COVID pandemic. In 2016, MISA was inaugurated by our president, our Irish president, Michael D. Higgins. And he was very impressed, as are many, by the fact that we have 4 pillars of which we put equal emphasis. A clinical care pillar, of course, a research and development pillar, education and training, which is very much what tonight is about, and a creative life pillar. Our new building is embedded in the heart of an acute hospital, which is pretty unique in the context of these islands. And it includes 116 beds and home to more than 300 staff. In addition to general medical services for older adults, MISA specializes in bone health, in falls and syncope, in memory, in psychiatry disorders, stroke, gerontological nursing, nutrition, physiotherapy, occupational therapy. And in the context of tonight, we have a tradition of annual public lectures. Our previous speakers include Professor Tom Mitchell, a very famous classicist, Professor Stacy Landau from Chicago, Professor Ian Robertson, neuroscience from Trinity, Professor Michael Longley, who is a poet from Queen's University, and Baroness Julia Neuberger, London. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce your host for this evening, who is Professor Romero-Ortuno. He's an associate professor in medical gerontology in Trinity College and a consultant physician in St. James's Hospital, where MISA is situated. Roman graduated from the University of Barcelona with a degree in medicine, but he also has a music degree from the Conservatory of Barcelona. He completed a master's in European social policy in the London School of Economics, and after that obtained a PhD in medical gerontology here in Trinity College. And before he returned to us here in Trinity and in St. James's, he was a consultant geriatrician in Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. He is also a faculty member of the Global Brain Health Institute, a very large brain health institute which we share for education and training of young fellows with UCSF. He's also a working co-chair for the Frailty group within the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging, TILDA, and is leading the development of the Irish Frailty Network in the Irish Gerontological Society. Roman's research contributions have been recognized by a number of awards, including the British Geriatrics Society's Rising Star Award, the Count of Cartagena Award from the Royal National Academy of Medicine in Spain, and most recently, a very prestigious Science Foundation of Ireland Award, the Presidents of Ireland's Future Research Leaders Award. So without further ado, I welcome you all. We'll have a stimulating night, I know that, and I hand you over to Roman.
Thank you very much, Roseanne. In normal circumstances, the MISA annual lecture tradition would have involved the courtesy of showing the MISA facilities to the distinguished lecturer. With COVID-19, this is unfortunately impossible, and instead, I will now invite Professor Rockwood and all the webinar attendees this afternoon to a short virtual tour of MISA.
Whatsoever, the Mercer Institute will continue to be a world field leader in the field of aging. And may I wish you every continued success with this development. It's going to be an
Without any further ado, I will now introduce you to Professor Kenneth Rockwood. He is Professor of Geriatric Medicine and Neurology and the Catherine Allen Weldon Professor of Alzheimer's Research at Dalhousie University in Halifax. As many of you know, he is a leading authority on frailty. Ken received his MD from Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, completed training in internal medicine at the University of Alberta, and in geriatric medicine from Dalhousie University. He also holds a master's degree in public administration by Queen's University, Ontario. Ken serves on the Lancet Commission on Dementia as an inaugural member of Canada's National Council on Dementia and on the Scientific Advisory Board of the Chinese National Centre for Gerontology. He is the Associate Director of the Canadian Collaboration on Neurodegeneration in Aging. Ken has published more than 500 peer-reviewed papers and 10 books. In 2016, he received the China Friendship Award, that country's highest honor for foreigners. Since 2017, he has held an appointment as Honorary Professor of Population Science and Experimental Medicine in University College London. Ken, most recently, has decided to become, in his own words, part of the problem, and added to his dues by taking on the role of Senior Medical Director for Acute Medicine for the Nova Scotia Health Authority in Canada. You will hear now Professor Rockwood's lecture, and at the end, there will be a brief turn of questions and answers please use the Q&A facility to write your questions.
Thank you, Ramon, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Roseanne, for the invitation to speak today. I'm very delighted to be able to do both. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make things work so I could share my screen, so I'm going to ask Ramon, who's generously agreed to help out, to set up the slides, and then we'll change them. So let's go with the first slide, please. There we go. So the title is Frailty in the Time of COVID-19. And this is proving to be an interesting topic, and one of a certain moment that I think was anticipatable, but I didn't anticipate it. Next slide, please. By the anticipatable, I mean that frailty should be an important topic, not that we're going to have COVID-19. So I have a relevant disclosure, which is that I've inserted copyright of the clinical frailty scale. We make it available freely for education, research, and not-for-profit care. We ask users not to change or commercialize it, which is why we need to assert copyright in the first instance. And I also have a wee company called DGI Clinical, and we work on individualized outcome measurement for a variety of manufacturers, but nothing on frailty. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Ah, very good. So the objectives are to outline the impact of frailty in 2020s and in ordinary time, and then to discuss how frailty and illness severity interact. And I want us to spend a little bit of time thinking about that because it has important and non-trivial consequences for what we're seeing these days. And just next button. And the reason it has these consequences is because the intersection of frailty and illness severity has some implications for ethical decision-making about how we access scarce resources in pandemic time, now that rationing is no longer theoretical. Next slide, please. So for some of you, this will be really well-trod ground, but let's start assuming that not everyone is confident they understand what the definition of frailty is. So the term came about in the modern era in 1979. It was introduced by a paper, Vopel and colleagues, in a demography journal. And it was meant to explain the inherent variability in the risk of death of people of the same age. And that has expanded subsequently to mean variability in the risk of an adverse outcome for people with the same degree of exposure, and has been used extensively in cancer modeling. And in fact, up until about 15 or 16 years ago, if you were to search frailty on PubMed, the most common uses of it were in respect of the use in that way, chiefly in cancer models. So the way we approach this, we say people have variable risks of death even though they're of the same age, or variable risk of adverse outcome even though of the same age, because people at the same age have varying numbers of things wrong with them. So what we figured out how to do is to translate that into what to count and a way to count, and then translate it back, which is what the clinical frailty scale seeks to do, in terms of what happens to people as they accumulate deficits. So across the life course, the rate of accumulation of deficits, of health deficits, of things wrong with you, goes up somewhere around 4.5 to 5.5% per year. But let's, for the sake of convenience, land on it being about just over 5% per year, which means it has a doubling time of every 15 years. And if we think that technically aging starts at the age of 15, because technically aging in gerontological terms is meant to convey the notion of an increase in the hazard rate. The increase in the hazard rate falls from birth down to about age 15, and then it starts to go up. So aging starts roughly at age 15. So it doubles every 15 years. So for most people, they'll be aware of this, because when you're 15 years old and you have almost nothing wrong with you, you go to 30, you still have twice almost nothing wrong. That's still almost nothing wrong. And you'll note that at that age, it's very uncommon that an age peer would have died of an illness, but that's much less common at age 45, and it's uncomfortably less common at age 60. Between age 60 and 75, it becomes more common than not that you at least know someone who's close to you in some way who has died. And between 75 and 90, that's the last doubling time that most people experience. There's obviously one between 90 and 105, but on a population basis, that's quite a small number of people who are left then. So we need to think about this in particular, because in 2021 is when the leading edge of the baby boom will turn 75 years old. So that's where we're going to see a really important year-over-year merciless increase in the number of people with multiple interacting medical and social problems. In other words, an increase in the number of people who are frail. Next slide, please. So as we think about risk, and again, I make the point, risk is bound up in the notion of frailty. I think we can think about at least 4 relevant risks having to do with frailty in pandemic times. So the first is to get the illness itself. The second is that the illness would be recognizably symptomatic. Older people, famously, as they get frail, are more prone to have disease presentations that have less to do with the particular symptom that's involved and more to do with what happens when a complex system comes close to failure, which is to say we see symptoms that reflect failure in a high order functions. And the high order functions are, from an evolutionary standpoint, upright bipedal ambulation, opposable thumbs, divided attention, social engagement. So the failure of these is taking to bed, falling down, becoming confused, being socially abandoned, and functional decline. And then the risk that you'll get that as the presentation increases. And then there's the risk of progression from general or mild illness to severe to critical illness, and then the risk of death at any stage of the disease, and possibly as a function of the degree of frailty, although there's some new data from the UK which suggests that, and from here that suggests it may not be quite as simple as that. Next slide, please. So way back when, in March 15th, which seems like months and months ago, there was some discussion at that point about, because the risk of death increased with age, unsurprisingly, and because it looked like, and in many places it was the case, that there were more people requiring service than there were resources available, the question came up as to where we expected that the age cutoff to be. I mean, it was clear not everyone could get the specialized services that they would need, and based more or less on what's called the fair innings argument, the thought was it would be logical to give people who hadn't had a chance to live out most of their lives the opportunity. So the question is, where should the age cutoff be? And of course, in this audience, that's a trick question. We know that we shouldn't be talking about an age cutoff for very pragmatic reasons. The age at which most people would die is so advanced that most people die ordinarily is so high that it wouldn't allow you to cut off enough people. So it's got to be something other than that. This is where the notion of frailty was proposed, and not by me, to be a means by which rationing could be made fairer. Not that I disagree with it, but just so we're clear. Next slide, please. So how do we measure frailty, right? Because if you don't measure something, you can't manage it. So I actually spent about 20 years, the first part of my career from the late 70s until 2001, thinking of a different way to measure frailty. And then I realized that didn't work, or it wasn't accomplishing the things that I felt needed to be done. So with my great friend and colleague, Arnold Mitninsky, the mathematician, we sorted out how to think about frailty in the simplest possible way, which is to say that people are frail, people are at greater risk when they have more things wrong with them compared with others of the same age. So the frailty index is, you count the number of health deficits someone has and divide by the number of things that you counted. So that may seem arbitrary, and to an extent it is, but what we mean is that a health deficit should meet these criteria. It should be bad for you, So there are some things that increase with age, but they're not bad for you. I used to point out gray hair being an example of that. Now I point out white hair as being an example of that. So it goes up with age, but it's not bad for you. In fact, arguably, it's a bit distinguished and allows you to make claims that you shouldn't just based on your white hair. But at the same time, if there are things that are bad for you, but they don't increase with age, we don't count those. So if left-handedness is bad for you, and as far as I know it's not, we wouldn't count it because it doesn't change with age, the same way for eye color and so on. So, and then there's some technical things around the way to handle the missing data, but basically it should increase with age to be a deficit, and it should be bad for you to be a deficit. And then because we're always working from a record, from a healthcare record or an epidemiological survey or something, there's only a certain number of things that were counted in the first instance in those records, and that's where the total number of possible deficits comes from. And there's a reference there in mechanism aging development, which we've tried to update that and bring all the evidence to bear in one place, and it's free online for anyone who's interested. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to take you through some really great work that was done by Professor Andy Clegg at Leicester, published in Age and Aging in 2016. And so I'm going to show you some data in which on the x-axis is age, and on the y-axis is the mean survival from 1,800 days. So as a group of people from 1,800 days, 365,000 of them, because it's done now routinely from GP records in the National Health Service in England. And then next slide, please. And you'll see that this is presented as a heat map. And the heat map is 0 when you have very few things wrong, in fact, the fewest things you could have wrong, and 0.6 or thereabouts, 0.67 actually in this series, when you had the most number of things that you could have wrong with you. You might say, well, hang on now, the most number of things you have wrong with you wouldn't be to 0.67, it should go to 1. That's what one would think until you realize that people die without having everything wrong with them. It looks like for interesting and important reasons, there's a cut point, and it's somewhere around 0.67 to 0.7, thereabouts. At least 99% of people will have died by that time, such as the relationship between mortality and the number of things wrong. So next slide, please. And so what you see here is the heat map. And if you can look at the age of 65 over the left and 95 at the right, you will see a couple of things that are particularly interesting. The first is that the distribution of the survival curves is very narrow at the age 65 and very wide at the age of 95. And sorry, I've got a flashing light on my thing. Then we'll see that even the fittest people at the age of 95, if you run your eye back over towards the left, you'll see that even the fittest people at the age of 95 on average are dying before the frailest people at the age of 65 in this series at least. And I think that's best understood by what I like to call Tyson's Law, after the great philosopher Michael Tyson, who said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. In other words, there's more to the overall degree of fitness and frailty than a frailty index counts. But this gives us a very good first approximation of the likelihood of survival. The final thing I want to draw to your attention is you'll see that at the bottom lines there are a lot of gaps. So even when you have 365,000 people, you run out of people with very high frailty index scores across the life course. Next slide, please. So what we said now is that frailty is a thing. It can be quantified. It's a state. It is understood in the context of a group of people. There's an age reference to it, and it captures intrinsic variability, which is virtually always there. In fact, in animal work that's been done in animals born and reared in the same circumstances with roughly the same genome, there will be variability in their ability to survive and prosper over their life course. So that's the frailty piece. So the second thing I want to talk to you about was acuity of illness. So something about frailty is that it makes people more susceptible to being acutely ill. And then when they're acutely ill, there's grades of acuity, there's grades of severity. And so I've been interested in this for some time. And so these are data on a bunch of people that I've seen. It was just published recently in Age and Aging. And we looked at 1,263 people there. I was interested in the ones I'm seeing in the emergency department when I'm running the internal medicine consult service there, as I am today. I have a colleague very kindly is looking after things for a couple hours. But what I do there, whenever I see someone over the age 65, I do a geriatric assessment on them, or more properly, I cause it to be done. And then I review each of those to try and get some sense of the degree of frailty based on a geriatric assessment. And then I translate that into a clinical frailty scale. And this gives you a way to understand how the clinical frailty scale works. So we did this so we have at least 2 years follow-up data, and that was 835 people there. And by the time we got down to the residents of Nova Scotia, it was 808 people. So I'm going to show you some data from this group. So the next slide, please. So we also then assessed the severity of the illness of these people. Or actually, we didn't. This is done automatically in the emergency department at triage using what's called the Canadian Triage and Acuity Scale, or CTAS, which is used nationally here. And CTAS levels 1 and 2 is someone who's very severely ill, and 3, 4, and 5 less so. So the frailty scale, which we're going to talk about next slide, please, is derived from a geriatric assessment. So here's the geriatric assessment form that we use. So the hospital where I work, we're so backwards, we're so primitive, we're so behind the times that we actually use this on paper. And next slide, please. And you can see that over on the right-hand side, there's some columns there which can be filled in terms of the clinical frailty scale. Next slide, please. So this is the CFS, the Clinical Frailty Scale, and it's meant to be an inclusive scale. There's room for everybody on it, starting with the very fit and moving down to the vulnerable, which if I had to do over again, I probably would have called the very mildly frail, but never mind. Then the mildly, moderately, and severely frail, or as we're rewording it now, severe frailty and very severe frailty and moderate frailty. So people living with these degrees of frailty would have these scores. And then you see at the end, there's one that's for people who are terminally ill. And you notice that although there's progressive mobility decline in the first, that's not the case for the person who's terminally ill, in as much as we recognize that some people can be functioning very, very well up until a week or two, or even a few days before they die, despite having a terminal illness. So that's not a mistake, that's meant to be there. Next slide, please. So building on the work from Romero-Ortuno at Cambridge in those days, who also looked at frailty and acuity of illness, I just want to draw to your attention that you can see that the chance of mortality increases across the degrees of frailty in the dark gray lines, but increases a whole lot more when that person is also severely ill, using the ED-Muse score, the medical early warning score. So the mortality risk is highest in the people who are living with the greatest degrees of frailty to start. And that's the property of any complex system. It's known popularly, or not uncommonly, as the Matthew effect. In other words, it says in the Gospel of Matthew, to them who have much, more shall be given. And to those without, even that they have shall be taken away. Also summarized in the phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this is what this is meant to show, that the highest toll for severe illness is in the people who were the most frail to start with. Next slide, please. And we found much the same thing. And here I've expressed it both as the odds ratio on the right-hand side of the graph, and as the probability of dying on the left-hand side. So let's just look at this. At the top of the graph is the Canadian Triage Acuity Scale, a score of 3 to 5. So people who are not very severely ill, even though they're acutely ill. And you can see that there is a very small gradient till you get to 7 to 9. So it's between 5 and 10% of people with clinical frailty scale scores up to a CFS of 6 will be dead at 30 days after they've been admitted to hospital. 7 to 9, that goes up to 32%. But it's where you see the acute illness that this really plays out. So fit people who are very severely ill have in fact a low rate of death, 1%. But by the time you get to CFS scores of severe and very severe frailty and terminal illness, you see that it goes up to 53%. Next slide, please. So again, the point is a 53% 30-day mortality prior to COVID-19 in people who are both severely ill and quite frail. And you can see that this carries on with respect to the 60-day, this should be the 6-month mortality. So 75% of people with CFS scores of 7 to 9 will be dead at that point if they've got a high degree of severity in their acute illness. Next slide, please. And we have started to look at this at a larger scale, and with my colleagues Sam Searle and Daniel Davis at UCL, they looked at the clinical frailty scale, and then they looked at a frailty index based only on routine laboratory, everyday in hospital lab tests. And what they're able to show here is that both items are important, that the degree of frailty is important, but so too is the degree of acuity of illness is measured by derangements in ordinary lab scores. And this holds for readmission and for survival. So the top are showing grades of frailty, the bottom showing grades of the FI lab, and both have explanatory value in multivariable model. Next slide, please. So what I've said so far is that I think we can agree it's not counterintuitive that if you're looking at numbers of people who come to the hospital, the people likely to do the least well overall will have the combination of both being severely ill, so everyone's acutely ill to get in the door. So they have the combination of being severely ill and living with severe or higher degrees of frailty at baseline. So the frailty status is based on their baseline state, not some estimate of frailty when they're ill. Based on their acute illness, it's on what they're like 2 weeks before they came ill. That's what the frailty score is trying to get at. So we know both those things, the baseline frailty and the severity of the acute illness. You get some insight into their chance of survival. And in ordinary time, that is enough to get you started to make advice, to give advice in the emergency department about what the chances of survivability of the illness are. But often you can't tell precisely enough for an individual about how things are likely to play out for them. And it turns out that that's where we need a dynamic component of our decision making. And in ordinary time, we often have the flexibility to wait a couple of days and see how things play out. So the work from UCL has taken a frailty index based on ordinary laboratory test data and operationalized that and looked at changes in that, which can be updated every day to give some insight into the probability of survival. But we can also do it without fancy lab tests. We can do it just by looking at people. And the thing that we can look at is how they move in bed when they're ill. And when someone is as ill as they can be, then their mobilities, you can see here at the score of 0. These numbers come from Roche scoring, but the words are just as important, easier to understand. When someone is ill as they can be, they need positioning in bed. And that's a clinical state. So if someone is so ill that they can't move off their pressure points, they're just lying there, there are a large number of clinical consequences that will flow from that, most of which will involve Teflon. So they'll need an IV, they'll need a Foley catheter, they'll likely need to be intubated if they can't guard their airway. It's a definable clinical state. If we look at couple of people I saw this morning, for example, that they're able to position themselves in bed, but they can't pull themselves to sit up, then that's a state, can position itself in bed, that has a better and a worse. And better is you can pull yourself to sit, where at least you can reach over and grab onto the bed rail and start to pull up the split rail, I hasten to add. And worse is that you can't even do that. And it turns out that even differences as small as that in bed mobility wind up having tremendous prognostic importance. Next slide, please. So here are data again from our hospital with my colleagues Ruth Hubbard and Eamon Eales. And Eamon and I took a group of patients, about 450, who we'd admitted to the hospital on the acute medicine service and acute geriatrics. And we looked at their bed mobility for the first 14 days. And what we found was there was a huge amount of information that came out in the first 48 hours. So that's what this paper published in Age and Aging in 2017 shows, that if you have people who whose mobility improves in the first 48 hours, they have a very good chance they'll have recovered. More than 80% of those people have recovered at 30 days. In the in-between group, where it simply remained the same without improvement, even in that case, the majority will improve by 30 days. But if you have people whose mobility imbalance gets worse in the first 48 hours, then very few of those people will survive to 30 days. And of those who survive, very few will have recovered. And unsurprisingly, the people most at risk for poor recovery are the people who are the frailest ones to start with. So next slide, please. And we see this now expressed in terms of the cumulative probabilities of survival. Next slide, please. It turns out that this holds in the intensive care unit. And here I'm showing you data from my colleague Sam Searle, the guy who's covering me in Emerge today, who is doing his PhD at UCL. And he's looking at a bunch of things, including the dynamics of variables that allow us to assess the likelihood of recovery. And on the component which is focused in the ICU, this is here at the Halifax Infirmary, what he's shown is that the same thing holds, except the time frame is not 24 hours, it's 48 hours. But we think this is important because it gives us then a way to not commit ourselves either in ordinary care and Emerge or the people who get admitted to the ICU, not to commit ourselves to the false dichotomy of, you know, will we do everything for your father or will we do nothing? Do you want him to live or not? That's not ours to promise. What our promise is we can give it a go, and that go may include intensive care, or it may include a number of things that would be much less invasive than intensive care. But it's not an open-ended promise that we'll keep going till the bitter end. It's that we're going to reevaluate in a couple of days or in a few days in the ICU to see what the chances of recovery are now. And so that's the framework that I've had in my mind that I brought to bear when the question came up about what do we do now when we're looking at people to come into the ICU. Next slide, please. So this is tough country. So bioethics in ordinary time is pretty straightforward. It's optimized for autonomy of the patient. So sometimes people say they want this or that, and if that's what they want, many of us feel that our obligation is to try and give it to them. Now, there's obviously system constraints and so on, but for the most part, in ordinary time, we imagine that trying to honor the autonomy of the patient, even in circumstances in which we are dubious about achieving a good outcome, if there's doubt, then the doubt should default to the wishes of the patient and the family, except in extraordinary circumstances of ordinary time. But that's not how we have to think in a pandemic. In the pandemic, we have to act to safeguard the system. And we've seen this play out poignantly and tragically in many large metropolitan areas where systems have become overwhelmed and healthcare workers have died as a consequence of attempts at heroic efforts to care for very ill patients, and we cannot be indifferent to that. So the pandemic tries to optimize for the best outcome for the system. Next slide, please. So the NICE, UK NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the UK, came up with this rapid guideline for critical care in adults. And the relevant bit out of their one-page infographic was that you should assess frailty if you're going to try and make this decision. So this was about access to critical care. So the point is moot about whether they're acutely ill. Yes, everybody who's being considered now is acutely ill, and that illness is severe, indeed critical. So the idea was the next piece of information that you need would be to look at frailty in people over the age of 65. That's important. So is the next phrase, without stable long-term disabilities, for example, cerebral palsy or learning disabilities or autism, because we don't know if the degree of disability, for example, or the degree of cognitive impairment or the degree of mobility limitation means anything near the same when it's been stable over a long period of time compared to when it's built up gradually to reflect the degree of impairment, the degree of deficit accumulation of the individual. And at that point, that they said to use the clinical frailty scale score, and intelligent people of goodwill will disagree over where that cut point should be. They felt 5 and over, one should be skeptical about use of scarce resources at that time. There's a body of work that suggests that it may well be a bit higher than that, that maybe 5 people living with mild frailty should be given a go in intensive care, but 6 and higher seems an unlikely outcome. And there's data, not from COVID-19, at least not much till now, but there's data to suggest that there is a cut point somewhere around there. Next slide, please. So, so we're trying to respond to the challenge of frailty. We're trying to use an imperfect marker, which is the degree of frailty, in which we built in clinical judgment. But it's not clinical judgment by a look from the bottom of the bed. Next slide, please. And again, please. So here are the things that the clinical frailty scale takes into account when it's been properly elicited and decisions have been made. Exercise, medical problems, symptom control, activity limitations, being slowed up, ADLs and IDLs, indoor activities, balance bathing. Next, please. Personal care, intimate care. Next, please. Recovery capacity, which is something that we're spending a fair amount of time trying to understand these days. Next, please. And of course, cognition. Next, please. And one of the really important points is if we see impairments in any of these things, we must ask, is this new? So that is a signal of severe illness, but if it's new, the chance for recovery is obviously higher than if it's not new. Next slide, please. So we know that the CF is an imperfect skill. We know that it requires judgment. We know that judgment is hazardous when people are, well, judgment is hazardous always, according to Hippocrates, right? Life is long, but the art is short, judgment hazardous. Nevertheless, if the tool is out there, we feel very much that we should try and make it the best it can be. So at the moment, with colleagues in several countries, we're trying an algorithm and seeing how that may help improving the reliability of the clinical frailty scale. If anyone wants to ask, I can tell you why we're focusing on reliability and not validity. Next slide, please. So I just want to sum up by going back to the objectives that we had. So I said I'd talk to you about the impact of frailty and illness severity on the outcomes of acute illness in older adults. And the bottom line is they jointly increase risk. And then I want to say, how do we operationalize this? Well, we have to have a severity measure and a frailty measure. But I also think that where we have the luxury of it, we should look for an answer that would include the initial treatment response, which is in the first 2 to 4 days. And what this means for ethical decision-making that access scarce resources in a pandemic is that looking at jointly the degree of frailty and severity of illness are the least arbitrary measures that we have. They're arguably the best of a poor lot that we have to try and understand now. Next slide, please. So it's been interesting to me to see how the clinical frailty scale has become adopted and the explosive increase just in the last few months. Sometimes it's interesting to see how soft markers work. So I saw this message on WhatsApp, and someone signed off by saying, "Thank you all, your great team. It's fun working with you. Enjoy the weekend, and may your CFSs all be one," which I emphasize and thank you. Now, I've just realized in this version, there should be an acknowledgement slide, and there's not. So I'm going to say the acknowledgement. So no one does work like this on their own. I've been really fortunate over my career to have support from the Canadian Institute of Health Research and its predecessor agencies, Alzheimer's Society of Canada, and here the Dalhousie Medical Research Foundation, which sponsors my chair, and the Fountain Family Innovation Fund, which gives me access to annual research funds, to the National Natural Science Council of China, and to other agencies that have funded me over the years. I thank all of them for listening, for their support, and I thank you for your attention and for listening. Thank you very much. Stop there and see what questions folks have.
Thank you very much, Ken. I think that's been a fantastic presentation. We do have a number of questions, and I fear I may not be able to address them all, but there are a question from Julian Mutz there. Are there any characteristics that have stood out as a characteristic of those individuals who do not become frail, even at very advanced age?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I remember years ago hearing a senior colleague of mine, some white-haired guy, to talk about the importance of choosing your parents wisely. And it seemed a bit of a snarky answer, but there seems to be a certain merit in that, but it's certainly not the whole story. So again, I'm aware very much that I suffer a bias in which I only get to see people professionally who are unwell, otherwise they wouldn't be seeing me. But I have been struck when I'm working in the emergency department and we're seeing everybody who comes in over the transom who gets referred to internal medicine, that we will not uncommonly see people who are vigorous. And it's the case that they have a few things in common. For the most part, they tend to have a vigorous outlook on life. Now, again, I don't know if you kind of acquire that when you're 95 years old because you survived, or if you've gotten there because you had that attitude. The people who have been athletic over their life course, and particularly from middle age on, are certainly overrepresented in the people who we see who are vigorous in late life, which I guess is not unsurprising either. The part of Canada that I'm from, Newfoundland, has some famously long-lived communities, and whatever else you can say about folks in Newfoundland, where that's coming from, is not the diet. But I'm sure that having a good diet must be important too, and there are places like Sardinia and whatnot where that is important. So is lifelong exercise. So. And I'm imagining if I knew more about it, it would be other things that Mom told me, like getting enough sleep and not being too stressed. And I'm hoping it would be not swearing, but there'd be things like that which will not be surprising to us. So I don't have any special insight beyond the sorts of, beyond an endorsement that the things we have been told culturally seem for the most part to be true. Again, that certainly doesn't mean that doing all those things is a guarantee. It just increases the chance.
That's fantastic, Ken. We've got a question from our nursing colleague, Deirdre Lang, in the Office of Nursing in the Health Service Executive here in Ireland, who really says it's fabulous to listen to you in real time. I think you've got a fan there. Also, she's asking you to please describe the dementia element of the clinical frailty scale, please.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the way that the clinical frailty scale is constructed is it's meant to capture the chance of having a particular type of high system impairment, a high order system impairment, as a function of the number of things you have wrong with you, as a function of the number of deficits. And although I didn't start this way and was careful for the longest time to say that the failure of the high order cognitive function is likely a failure of attention, a lot of work that we have done lately, including some particularly good work done with a young PhD student, Lindsay Wallace, and now just a fabulous postdoc, David Ward, and other groups that we have worked with, there's a very good case to be made that we should think about dementia as a higher system failure on two grounds. Number one is that it's not that people are disabled as a consequence of their dementia. That is inevitably the case, and that is really the question you've asked, and I will get back to that. Mm-hmm. Is that for any degree of neuropathology, this is a paper from Lindsay's PhD published in Lancet Neurology last year and just replicated at scale in work that David Ward is doing with us. For any degree of neuropathology, the chance of it turning into dementia is a function of the degree of frailty that people have. It's moderated by the degree of frailty. So people who have, including BRCA4 stage of tauopathy and amyloid, and who don't express dementia clinically, whatever else we can say about them, we can say that they're not real frail. And in same measure, people with only a small degree that is below the threshold for a neuropathological diagnosis of dementia, who do express it, they tend to be quite frail. So the way that we, but more pragmatically and addressing that element of your question, the way we incorporate this in the clinical frailty scale is we use the same type of staging that's used for dementia staging. So people living with mild dementia have varying degrees of impairment in their instrumental ADLs, but they're independent for the most part in their personal activities of daily living. And the people who have severe dementia are likewise, they're dependent in their IDLs, again, for the most part, but then they are dependent as well on their personal activities. And frailty is staged not coincidentally to look like that. Mm-hmm. And it looks like that because of the chance in which these things will be true of you as the number of deficits increase. So, for example, work done with Olga Theo and Daniel Davis map this to mobility and to impaired function. You can still use the clinical frailty scale on someone who has dementia, but you're unlikely to come up with, not unlikely, it's as a first approximation, mild frailty will go with mild dementia and severe frailty with severe dementia. So there's a certain homology between them, but there's homology between them for good reason. And the math drives us there.
I'm going to ask you one more question before I address another question to Roseanne next. But our colleague from the Irish Frailty Network in Cork, Emer Ahern, she recently developed a very interesting training tool on the clinical frailty scale that perhaps you've seen, Ken. She says she's also a fan of yours, and she'll be interested to know, would the CFS be best used after or with comprehensive geriatric assessment?
So in my practice, I do the CGA first, or as I say, cause it to be done. I have people now, and then I do the CFS after. Again, you can't turn your brain off, and I'm certain when I walk into the room of someone who may not have had the CGA done, that I'm processing a fair amount of information to help me understand the degree of frailty that the individual has. But even at that, I'm still very big on the exam. I'm still very big that we look at hip flexors and standing balance and things that really give us some insight and a better ability to quantitate what it is we see. I have seen the UCC slides, by the way, and there's a paper out just now in the CME Journal of the Canadian Geriatric Society, where we provided a link to that. On our website, we provided the link to that as well. There's a very big need for this type of training information. So we've got that there. We've got the one from the CFS app. And we've got a link to the Dan McIsaac work from the University of Ottawa. And I think these are really, really valuable resources. And like anything else, you know, see one and then spend a little time with some frail patients, and then see the next one, and so on. I think in a reasonably short period of time, someone could become, you know, a dab hand at it.
That's great, Ken. The next question comes from John Travers, and I'm going to address it to Roseanne in the first instance. John Travers is a trainee in general practice with huge academic interests. You may have seen his systematic reviews on delaying and reversing frailty, one very famous one in the British Journal of General Practice. John is asking, would it be reasonable, Roseanne, to consider resilience to be the flip side of frailty? And might older people embrace interventions to build resilience better than interventions to delay frailty?
Well, it's a good question. I think he knows the answer. I mean, frailty is clearly a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, resilience, I think it's reasonable to suggest that that's one end of the spectrum. But the resilience of itself is a very deep concept, actually. And doesn't necessarily entirely overlap with non-frail. It has a whole lot of psychosocial implications in addition to the physical and ADL and cognitive components of the more traditional frailty scales. And intervention, what was the question around intervention?
Interventions that older people might embrace more. So the question was, do you think it might be older people might embrace interventions to improve resilience more than interventions to improve frailty?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I actually think a positive message is easier for people to engage with, and particularly engage at an earlier stage. And from one of the outcomes from Ken's lecture, I hope, is that people listening will realize that the earlier we intervene with good, strong public health messages with respect to physical activity, diet, etc., the better with respect to staving off frailty and reducing the burden of frailty in later life.
Absolutely, and indeed, systematic reviews have shown that physiotherapy, so physical therapy, nutrition optimization, social engagement, health education are indeed, of great value to try to delay and reverse the onset of frailty, no matter how you define it. We also have Dr. Mimi Fan here on the call, and she recently recovered from COVID herself, very successful. I hope she's doing well. She's asking, well, first thanking you for a wonderful lecture, and I suppose she's talking about cocooning. I don't know if, Ken, you've heard about this concept. I suppose the pandemic brought these measures where older people were asked to self-isolate at home and avoid, face-to-face contact with the external world, and that was termed cocooning. I suppose, to denote this kind of self-isolation. Dr. Fan is asking, do you think the impact of isolation and cocooning with subsequent decrease in activities may have exacerbated frailty at the community level post-COVID-19?
I'm certain that there will be a lot of adverse consequences of the isolation. My brother, who's quite a humorous man, an orthopedic surgeon, said that he was certainly looking forward to being able to get to be with other people soon, and he wasn't sure which group he'd start with first, whether it be Alcoholics Anonymous or Weight Watchers. I think many of us are feeling the need to get back to our previously healthy lifestyles. I've found, so I mean, I've been really, really privileged because I get to come to work every day, get paid for it, do a job I love, you know, with not very great risk. But I know that for people who've been cooped up, who haven't been able to get out and see anyone, who may just be seeing their spouse, there are real important challenges that are arising as a consequence of this. And the Zoom, I mean, as good as it is, and this is great, you know, Zoom meetings are tremendously tiring, I find. So I expect that there will be a number of consequences of this, and as we emerge from it, we'll need to understand that well. And I just want to share just one other point here. At the start of this, I was in England, and I had the great privilege to hear a public health doctor who's very experienced in pandemics say, if you've never been through a public health emergency, your career afterwards will be defined by what happened prior to, you know, the great pandemic of 2020 and what happened after. And that what you did during that time would be really important to the way that you think about your practice and indeed understand aspects of your life. So I've tried to bear that in mind as we've been through some of the really trying aspects of this work. I think people can expect to look to Ireland and to some extent Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Atlantic Canada, where the artistic culture is very strong, and where people are able to reflect on their experience and to put it poignantly in words they're not afraid to utter. I think we can expect important contributions from places where the artistic culture is strong to help us understand as society what it is we've been through.
One more question there, Ken, if you don't mind, from Grace Park. With regard to 48 hours to improve mobility, increasing chances for survival of 30 days. Grace is wondering, does this take into consideration the availability of rehab staff in some facilities more so than other, or is this an intrinsic improvement in mobility measured in some way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer more precisely. So I'm from Canada, right? You know the joke, why did the Canadian chicken cross the road? To get to the middle. So my cultural instinct is to say, well, they must both be true, and it'd be hard to imagine otherwise. But surely that must mean we have an opportunity, if we're a bit more vigorous with the rehabilitation, to achieve better outcomes. And I've been really, really privileged to work with the geriatric assessment unit, where physiotherapy is a strength. We have one physiotherapist who is spectacularly good. He can motivate anyone and can mobilize people and make everybody feel better as a consequence of it. And I'm certain I've seen outcomes that would not have been achieved elsewhere except for that amount of skill and enthusiasm. So we you know, in all aspects of healthcare, we depend somewhat on the operator, but we need to find out the elements of this that are translatable and work at our best to promulgate and translate those. So thank you for that question. That's really good. Can I just say a word about resilience? So I agree with everything that Roseanne has said. I've also been very privileged in the last several years to work with a group of physicists here on a project we call the Physics of Frailty. And so to the physicists, they have a really good quantitative way to think about, for example, the intensity of initial treatment response, why what you see early is going to have a determining effect on what you see otherwise, and how to quantify that and such. And it's been very clear as we do this that as resilience runs out, it becomes easier to be frail. But it's also clear that much of this depends on the exposure that people have. And so we shouldn't, as we're thinking about this, we should also think about the ways in which we can quantitate the environment and the hazard of an environment, and the hazard of an environment in which you don't feel safe to walk home, or you feel lonely when you're in your own home. There's a large number of things like that which play out true. They play out deeply. They play out in in how recovery time works and recovery capacity works. And they're still complicated. We can only honor them if we look at the whole of the system. And fortunately, through physics and network theory and other important analytical techniques, we're actually able to quantify this and think about it in a reasonable way. So I'm at the stage of my career, people ask, well, how come you're sticking with that frailty stuff? Like, you know, resilience, don't people prefer that? Well, they might well do. And certainly for marketing, we've got to make sure we're having a positive message. God knows enough gloom and doom about aging. But from the scientific standpoint, we need to make sure that we don't ignore a bunch of quantitative approaches because of the words that are associated with them. We really need to see the opportunity that's there for how this all plays out. I'll finish by saying one thing. So frailty is about aging, and successful aging is not simply the province of people who are fit. So I recently I've had the opportunity to deal with some very, very old people, more than 100 years old, and for the same degree of frailty that they have, there's a huge variability in their outlook on life. There's a huge variability in how they conceive of success in their lives. I think that's really inspiring. I think it's really important that we underscore what Roseanne has said, that we shouldn't simply think about resilience as the opposite of frailty, that we can still find people who are very frail and yet very resilient. And that's one of the things that COVID-19 should teach us. So on a floor with 21 residents, 17 of them get COVID-19, but only 4 of them progress to severe and then critical illness, and 4 of them never get it. And these are all people who would have CFS scores of either 7 or 8. So we can't stop with that. We got to look at these other bits too.
Absolutely, Ken. On that point of successful aging, it comes very close to why the Mercer Institute is also called successful aging. A lot of people really ask about that. I perhaps extend it to 4 more minutes. I've got 24 open questions, and I apologize that it's not going to be possible to answer them all. Mary O'Shea from the Longitudinal Study of Aging is referring to the importance of education. Of course, you know, in Ireland here, we have a national frailty education program, and also from Trinity College, we are promoting outside education in terms of new frailty modules and programs that, you know, will build, you know, the skills that are needed into the workforce. So Mary O'Shea really is asking your reflections on whether we are still investing enough effort in frailty prevention and how important education is in that.
So frailty is a fundamental challenge to the way we provide healthcare right now. And I think that extends to the way we think about public health. So public health clearly are way out in front of us, because the things that are going to be good for some illnesses will be good for a bunch. So it's not for nothing. There's a shared body of risk factors that include inactivity, for example, and a shared body of things that are advantageous, which include physical activity and social engagement. So I think that we need to do more. I'm not sure if doing it under the rubric of frailty is going to be that helpful. So I agree with the prior question. We may motivate a substantial body of people who are not frail with the idea of, you know, staying fit. But I do think that amongst people who are frail, they're not unaware of their condition. I mean, they're not all men. They don't all live in denial. So things that might motivate them to do things in which they can themselves see the benefit to themselves in ways that are important to them. I think that's really where we need to be. And so just like you know, the existential threat that frailty challenges which challenges healthcare is that we've gotten so much better in a lot of areas of medicine because we have people with very precise skills. I mean, that's one of the great things about this job I do with the internal medicine consult service. You know, we look at stuff and we can see and get things sorted. But if I've got a really tough problem, if I've got something I really don't understand, I can phone up someone in the hospital, and there'll be someone who, like, it's their thing, right? Oh, got this platelet count with that. Why? This is the thing that I do. So how fantastic, right? An illness which is complicated. We have people who rejoice in that, and will come and hoe in with a glad heart, look after that person. But that metaphor of the thing wrong, that's not gonna work for people who are frail. You can harm people who are frail who keep looking for the things wrong. We have to start to understand things from the standpoint of the whole system. And so I would imagine that the approach that we would take is an educational one at many areas that includes education of the public, what to expect, but education by the health care professionals about what they need to provide and how you actually look after people who have the thing you're most interested in and 10 other things wrong too. If you can't figure it out, do the thing you're interested in, but don't do it at the expense of all the other things that can go awry with that. And that's a big challenge. The attitudinal challenge is way more than the factual challenge in terms of the education that needs to be done.
Absolutely, Ken. We've got many more questions. We've got also a lot of thank you messages, including a thank you message from Tash Massoud, the president of the British Geriatric Society. And I'm afraid I couldn't really go on answering questions. There's questions on delirium, there's questions on morbidity, recovery, resilience, and a lot of that has been covered, but I think we'll have to bring you back for loads of other questions, Ken. At this point, I would like to invite Professor Roseanne Kenny to close this webinar.
Delighted. Thank you so much, Ken. That was wonderful, as expected. And thank you, Roman, and thank you very much to all of our attendees. And one of the things that struck me during the conversation and the questions particularly was, in the context of resilience, was the role that COVID has played through the media in actually undermining the confidence in aging and ageist, the volume of ageist terminology and ageist thresholds that have been used for interventions, etc. So I think as a community, the number of hundreds of people who are listening, this is something that we have to be mindful for. And it's really hard if you are an older person to remain resilient and have positive perceptions and a positive attitude towards aging when there's this persistent deluge of negative language in media and even in our health, unfortunately, in some of our healthcare systems. So thank you all. Thank you to those who helped to organize the this evening. Roman, of course, who was instrumental in making all of this happen. Ken, our great speaker, and his team in Newfoundland. And of course, there's a lot of commonality between Ireland and Newfoundland, and many Irish people emigrated to Canada, and that was their first stop, including my own parents, who spent some time in Nova Scotia. So thank you to Rachel Kendall, Helen Fitzpatrick, Siobhan Hedigan, Roisin Neville, Snehal Prabhu-Kelgasker, Judy Oxley, and Carol Murphy, and Paul Quinlan, who prepared the virtual visit of MISA for those of you who are listening. Goodbye, Slán agus Beannacht os Irlandais, and stay safe and well, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.